The English Civil War was a series of armed conflicts between parliamentarians and royalists. The First and Second Wars pitted the supporters of King Charles I against the supporters of Long Parliament. The Third War was fought between the supporters of King Charles II and the supporters of Rump Parliament.
Now, there has been various interpretations put forth as to why the Civil War occurred in England. Now, one of the first reasons cited by a historian as to why the Civil War took place in England is by Gardiner, who is a 19th century historian, and who says that it was actually a war of ideas, whereby the people of dissenting religious beliefs, primarily the Puritans, as well as the supporters of constitutionalism, they went against the monarchy or the monarchical system, and thus we have the Civil War.
More than focusing on who ruled, the English Civil War concerned itself with the manner of governing Britain and Ireland. The wars led to the convention that a monarch could not govern without the consent and guidance of the Parliament. The Civil War led to the trial and execution of Charles I, the exile of his son Charles II, and replacement of English monarchy with, first, the Commonwealth of England, and then with the Protectorate under Oliver Cromwell's personal rule.
Trevor Roper has also tried to put the English Revolution in the context of the 17th century crisis that prevailed in Europe. He says that just as the rest of the European countries, whether it was Portugal or it was Spain or it was Holland or it was Naples, were witnessing some kind of disturbance or the other in the form of revolts and rebellions, be they urban or rural. Similarly, in England, the manifestation of the 17th century crisis was the English Civil War.
S.R. Gardiner popularized the English Civil War as a Puritan revolution, where people fought for their traditional rights against arbitrary monarchical power.
Along with the fact that this was a war of ideas, it was also a war because of various economic discrepancies that had set into the English society. Where the Marxist historians are concerned, they of course give a very different, it's a continuation of the second interpretation of as to why the Civil War took place in England, and they say that the Civil War was actually a war between the up and coming gentry against the feudal aristocracy, because this feudal aristocracy, in spite of the fact that they were no longer relevant under the changing circumstances, were not willing to give up their preponderant position in society, and they could only be lodged or dislodged by a violent agitation.
According to Marxist historian Christopher Hill, the Civil War was a class war, in which the despotism of Charles I was defended by the reactionary forces of the established church and conservative landlords. On the other side stood the trading and industrial classes in town and countryside.
There is a weakness of this Marxist hypothesis also, because it's not that the gentry were capitalists. And it was also not that all the aristocrats were very feudal. Now, we see that those who supported the king and those who opposed the king were always, there was no clear straitjacket division between the two, that it is always the gentry who supported the parliamentarians and it was always the aristocracy who supported the king. It was different elsewhere. As if you say that it was the Civil War was a war fought to keep intact the feudal system that existed in England, again there we will go wrong, because we know that feudalism as we know it, a feudal lord possessing an army of retainers, this was something which was increasingly becoming a rarity in England. Moreover, if you think that all the feudal lords supported the English king against the parliament, then too it would be a wrong assumption. Two small examples may be given here. For example, we see that the Earl of Derby, who could be called a feudal ruler because he did have an army of retainers, supported the king, whereas we find the Earl of Northumberland, who was a very, very important landed magnate of England at that time, did not support the royalty. So it is not such a simple explanation of the cause of the English Civil War that it was a war primarily between the gentry, the up and coming gentry, against the landed aristocracy. If we try to analyze the cause of the Civil War in a way which suits our modern industrial perception of society, it would be very wrong. Some historians have tried to see or interpret the Civil War in terms of a class struggle. Now, it is a very wrong analysis of the causes of the English Civil War, because we see that the pace of advancement of capital in England at this period that we are talking about in 1640 had not reached that stage whereby England had already reached a period of industrial capitalism or capitalist development. The transition from feudalism to capitalism was not complete in England, nor was industrialization, nor had industrialization started even in the 1640s. When we're talking about industrialization, we're talking about the growth of modern industries, whereby this class struggle could be possible in England. So the question of the Civil War being a class struggle is again not a very correct analysis of the cause of the English Civil War. Now, if we talk about class struggle, we talk about two groups of people, the haves and the have-nots. But the English Civil War was not a war between the haves and the have-nots. It was actually a bid by the two section of the haves, the two section of the haves, that is those who were of the older gentry class and those who were emerging as the new propertied classes. Another very interesting interpretation has been put forth by Professor Trevor Roper when he talks about the gentry as two groups, the declining or the mere gentry, and he talks about the court gentry. Now, it was this declining of the mere gentry, they were prevented from access to any kind of office, they were prevented from the court, and they were prevented from trade. And they were actually wanting to, regain their position. And we have the gentry of the court who were preventing them or trying to prevent them from getting or coming closer to the court. Now this view can be supported, or there are a group of people who support this view based on the fact that Cromwell belonged to the mere gentry. If you look at the antecedents of Cromwell, who finally became the chief of the protectorate, then you will see that he belonged to the mere gentry. So, supporters of this view that this was actually a struggle between the mere gentry and the court gentry cite the example of Cromwell to support their view or to substantiate their contention.
The parliamentarians consolidated their martial resources under the banner of the New Model Army. The New Model Army of Great Britain was formed in 1645 by the parliamentarians. It was organized as a force committed to serving any place within the country, rather than being tied to a single area or garrison. Its soldiers and officers became full-time professionals, rather than being regarded as members of part-time militia. They did not have any link to political or religious factions among the parliamentarians. Sir Thomas Fairfax was appointed as the first Captain General of the new model army.
If you look at the regional distribution of the Civil War, then you will see that there were the Parliament's army and the King's army, but you could not say that the King was supported only by such and such people from such and such region, and the Parliament was supported by this group of people from such and such region, because cutting across regions, cutting across localities, you have, and cutting across classes, you have different sections of the population supporting different groups, that is the Parliament on the one hand and the King on the other, and it was mainly the personal conviction of the people which made them choose between the Parliament and the King.
In two decisive battles, namely the Battle of Naseby and the Battle of Langport, the parliamentarians effectively destroyed the royal armies. Charles was eventually handed over to the English Parliament by the Scots and was imprisoned.
The Scots had fought in the Civil War. If you look at the domain of the King that existed prior to the Civil War, it was divided into three kingdoms. What was it? Ireland, Scotland and England. Now, the Scots had fought in the Civil War, and the Parliament which became victorious, or which was victorious, was not willing to let the Scots remain for very long in England. So they were willing to pay the war indemnity to the Scots so that they would leave England. This again resulted in another problem as far as England was concerned. The new government which was formed did not have enough money. The money that was paid to the Scots actually caused a drain in the exchequer.
Meanwhile, Charles I escaped from prison and fled to the Isle of Wight in a bid to reorganize his forces, but he was soon recaptured and sent to the Windsor Castle.
We find the second phase of the Civil War, because where the king was kept in confinement, he managed to gather supporters around him, and thus broke out the second phase of the Civil War. Eventually, we know that the king was tried at court and he was executed.
In July 1648, the Second English Civil War broke out. The new model army routed English royalist insurrections in Surrey and Kent and in Wales, before crushing the Scottish invasion force at the Battle of Preston. Many of the army's radicals now called for the execution of the king, whom they called Charles Stuart, that man of blood.
Now the question is, why was the king executed? The king was executed because it's not because the Parliament thought that the execution of Charles I would solve all the problems of England, but they felt that the execution of the king was absolutely necessary because that would at least try to alleviate some of the problems that England was facing at that time.
On January 6, 1649, the Rump Parliament assembled. All the members who were in favor of negotiating with the king were expelled. The Rump Parliament acquired the rights to make the new acts without the king's approval. King Charles was found guilty of high treason by a High Court of Justice especially set up for the trial. He was beheaded on January 30, 1649. It was an hour of triumph for the Parliament. The Parliament had, to a large degree, encouraged the radical political groups. It had also unwittingly established a new political force when it set up the new model army. These groups had their own hopes for the new Commonwealth.
Now, when you have the government of the Protectorate, you find that there are the cause of the war, as to who fought the war and why it was fought, because there was no singular reason as to why the war was fought. There were various demands from various quarters. You have very radical demands being put forth, and you also have the parliament which was not willing to make the government representative. And this resulted in the parliament and the group who wanted a change. It was a kind of an ensuing struggle between the two. That is, a struggle between the radicals and the parliament.
Led by John Lilburne, Levellers, in their manifesto Agreement of the People, asked for a more representative and accountable parliament that would meet every 2 years, and a reform of law available to all and fair to all. Though they wanted a more democratic society, their proposed franchise did not extend to women or to the lowest orders of society.
When we talk about the Levellers, we talk about the agreement of the people. What was the agreement of the people? It was decided that a parliament would be formed, a new parliament would be formed, which would be a representative parliament based on adult franchise, based on adult suffrage, again of course with property considerations, but the House of Lords would be dissolved, and the House of Commons would be a representative body which would run the parliament. But we find that the parliamentarians objected to this because they felt that the forces of the royalty, or those who were with the royalty, might make a comeback. Secondly, they also felt that had such a representative government come into force, their preponderance in society would not be there. And England was not yet ready for a representative government which was based on the power of the peasant population. So they objected to this, and so compromise formula was chalked out, where you have the rule of the protectorate.
On April 20, 1653, Oliver Cromwell forcibly dismissed the Rump Parliament. Cromwell established his protectorate and became the first Lord Protector of the Commonwealth of England, Scotland and Ireland.
Where the protectorate is concerned, if you analyze what the protectorate was actually trying to achieve, nothing much was achieved. If you look at the various educational institutions that were there, what actually happened to Uxbridge, that is Oxford and Cambridge, was the religious, those Anglican heads were removed, and in their place you had the Puritan heads coming in. But not much was done in the field of education also. Where Cromwell is concerned, Cromwell actually wanted to talk. He spoke about all the Protestant countries of Europe coming together and forming a kind of a league. And thereby we find him entering into alliances with Portugal, entering into alliances with the Baltic, so that England could trade with the Baltic, England could trade in the colonies of Portugal, and so on and so forth. And he also, because he wanted to revive the position of England in the eyes of the world, he was also very interested in reviving the naval might of England. And with this in view, he tried to make the recruitment, or he sort of started the recruitment in the Navy, and also made naval positions remunerative. He started paying the naval officers, or those who joined the Navy, that is. But where he went wrong was that continent politics in Europe had changed. After Richelieu, the European politics had changed. The politics in Europe was no longer controlled by religion, as it was controlled by real politics. Real politics is diplomacy, it is not religion. But because of Cromwell's these grand designs of trying to form a Protestant league, of trying to reorganize the navy, and his attempts to revive the prestige of England in the eyes of the world, we find that he incurred a lot of expenses. Where would the money come from? The money would have to come from England itself. So he resorted to strong arm tactics, taxation, and this fell on the people. So instead of, actually the civil war was fought to escape the oppressiveness of Charles I's regime. But this was being replicated by Cromwell's protectorate in the sense that the people could not escape this dragnet of oppression.
Upon his death, Oliver Cromwell's son Richard became Lord Protector, but the army had little confidence in him. After 7 months, the army removed Richard and reinstated the rump. There was little unity among the factions in the new model army. The rump parliament was dissolved for the second time, and prospects of total anarchy loomed large.
The misadventure of the government of the protectorate actually made the people of England so apprehensive towards a secular government that they very willingly wanted the restoration of Charles II. And with the restoration of Charles II, we find the rule of the protectorate finally coming to an end.
Charles II returned from exile on 23rd May 1660. On 29th May 1660, the majority of population in London acclaimed him as king. His coronation took place at Westminster Abbey on 23rd April 1661. These events became known as the English Restoration. Although the monarchy was restored, it was still only with the consent of Parliament. Therefore, the civil wars effectively set England and Scotland on a course to a parliamentary monarchy form of government.
ইংল্যান্ডের গৌরবময় বিপ্লব যেই কারণে হয়েছিল সেটা মানে প্রকৃত উদ্দেশ্যটাই ব্যর্থ হয়ে গেল, আবার রাজতন্ত্র ফিরে এলো।
The parliament was not willing to abdicate their power in favor of a representative government because they felt that it's not that the parliament was ruling badly. In fact, one of the major opposition of Cromwell to the parliament's government was this, that he did not object to the rule of the parliament. What did he object to? That this is politics without morality. That what the civil war was fought for. It was rule without idealism. So the aim of the civil war could never be fulfilled because different groups fought for different reasons. There was the ultra radical, there was the middle radical, and there were those who were actually trying to replicate the rule of the monarchy but under a different garb.
ম্যাম, এই সিভিল ওয়ারের পেছনে পিউরিটানবাদের ভূমিকা কতটা?
When Cromwell comes to power, that is during the time of the protectorate, one thing that has to be kept in mind is that Cromwell was, where religious tolerance was concerned, he was tolerant. Of course, he did not allow the Anglicans to preach openly, but he did not persecute them either. Neither did he persecute the Roman Catholics. In fact, he allowed the Jews to come back to England. So, the Puritans were against the Anglican Church, and the discontentment of various sections of the English society against the functioning of the king or the royalty, along with this discontent was added the discontentment of the Puritans because they were being persecuted by the royalty.
ম্যাম, মানে গৃহযুদ্ধের পরে যে রাজতন্ত্রটা ফিরে এলো সেটা তো নিয়মতান্ত্রিক রাজতন্ত্র ছিল। তো সেই নিয়মতান্ত্রিক রাজতন্ত্রটা মানে ইংল্যান্ডে কতটা উদারনৈতিক শাসন ব্যবস্থা প্রবর্তন করতে পেরেছিল?
One of the major demands of the Levelers was this, that they wanted greater representation, not the rule of parliament, because who were in the parliament, whether it was the House of the Lords or the House of the Commons, you needed property qualifications to become members of the House of Parliament. Now, what about the landless labourer? If you take the argument that every human being is potentially a saint, then every human being has equal ability and they should have equal rights also. So if this is the argument, then after the rule of the protectorate, you could never imagine that the people would subscribe to the rule of the monarchy without actually pressing for certain demands that, or certain demands which would be conducive to the interest of the common man. And that is something which increasingly is going to be voiced by the parliament.
বিল অফ রাইটসের মাধ্যমে তো আমরা দেখতে পাই সেই অভিজাত এবং রাজশক্তির মধ্যে একটা ক্ষমতা ভাগাভাগি করে নেওয়ার একটা প্রবণতা, সেক্ষেত্রে তো সাধারণ মানুষের সেরকম কোনোই লাভ হয়নি।
The 17th century was not the time in England where you could have a government of what is called the common man, because they were not politically ready to share that kind of power. It would come much later, where, and it is going to come very slowly. It is, even when suffrage is made open, it's not made universal. You have property qualification as far as suffrage is concerned, because it was felt that there was only one class of people who were responsible enough to carry out the functions of a government. It is, you have to look at the mentality also. The general mentality of the people was also this, that everyone cannot become a ruler. There will be a stratification in society between the ruled and the rulers and the ruled.